"You don't belong here," a voice whispered across the marble-floored room just as Aaliyah Johnson stepped through the glass doors, the words hanging like a fragile echo before the laughter of executives filled the space, a low, dismissive hum that bounced off the tall ceilings, her polished shoes making a quiet tap against the tiles, each step deliberate, calm, a soft rhythm in contrast to the sharp whispers of disdain. The chandelier overhead casting cold reflections that flickered across the faces of men in tailored suits. Charles Whitman at the head of the table leaning back, smirking, fingers steepled as if her presence were an annoyance too minor to acknowledge. She moved further in, eyes scanning the table, noticing a folder left slightly askew, papers peeking from the edge, a subtle detail unnoticed by everyone else. The air was thick with the kind of tension that settles before a storm. A brief pause as a junior analyst shifted in his chair, glanced at her sideways, quickly, averting his gaze. The room exhaled collectively yet without realizing. Aaliyah reached the end of the table, hand brushing lightly over the smooth mahogany. The scent of polished wood and lingering coffee mixing in the cool air. She bent slightly to pick up the folder, flipping it open just enough to reveal the first page of the contract, her thumb marking a section in paragraph 14. The words inside almost ordinary, but her eyes caught the subtle clause shifting liability in a way that could cost the shareholders millions. She straightened, shoulders back, heart steady, voice clear, cutting through the quiet murmurs. This clause, if signed as is, transfers all financial responsibility away from the shareholders. A ripple moved across the room. Heads turned, pens paused midair, some adjusting glasses to focus, others leaning back, disbelief flickering on their faces. Charles's smirk faltered, replaced with a tight line of surprise, the chandelier's reflection glinting in his eyes. As he scanned her expression, the calm confidence in her gaze making him pause, Aaliyah continued, tracing the margin with her finger, explaining the potential consequences with precise, measured words. Each syllable deliberate, commanding attention not by volume but by authority. The tension thickened, her presence suddenly impossible to ignore, murmurs quieted, the air electric with curiosity and rising doubt. She stood upright, letting the folder rest lightly on the table, eyes meeting those of every executive, silently challenging the assumptions they had all made about her. The room frozen, caught between disbelief and recognition, and for a fleeting moment, Charles looked past her casual attire, past the initial judgments, and glimpsed a hint of the power and knowledge she carried. A realization so subtle yet sharp, the cold light catching the edge of the folder like a beacon, signaling that the quiet girl they had dismissed was far more than she seemed. A flicker of intrigue passed through the room, the first step of a turning tide. As Aaliyah straightened her blazer, a faint, confident smile playing at the corner of her lips, leaving a lingering sense that this encounter was only the beginning of a revelation that none in the room would soon forget. Aaliyah Johnson stood quietly as the executives leaned forward, their eyes flicking between her and the open contract, the polished surface of the table reflecting the overhead light like a mirror that could not hide the tension building in the room. She adjusted her blazer, fingers brushing the edge of the folder with a subtle, yet purposeful motion, her voice calm but unwavering. "I have reviewed the entire merger proposal, and there is a clause that could expose the shareholders to significant risk if left unaddressed." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. The murmurs softened as heads tilted, pens still hovering above documents, a faint hum of the air conditioning the only sound besides the distant city traffic filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Charles Whitman leaned slightly forward, brow furrowed, glancing at the legal team who shuffled papers nervously. "Are you suggesting that we take another look at the liabilities section?" one of the senior associates asked, voice cautious, while another adjusted his glasses, lips pressed into a thin line, clearly trying to mask a rising unease. Aaliyah nodded, keeping her composure. "Yes, sir. Specifically paragraph 14, subsection C, line 3. It transfers financial responsibility in a way that could result in the company absorbing the losses instead of mitigating risk as intended." Her eyes never wavered from Charles, who now seemed momentarily unsettled, his hand tapping lightly on the table as if measuring the weight of her confidence. The room held its collective breath, the usual chatter replaced by a charged silence, a sense of anticipation hanging like a tangible mist. The chandeliers above flickered gently in the reflection, shadows stretching along the polished marble floor, subtle but noticeable. Aaliyah allowed herself a measured glance around the room, noting the expressions of surprise and curiosity, some executives exchanging quick, quiet whispers. A glance of acknowledgement passing between two junior analysts who had initially laughed at her, realizing they had underestimated the depth of her knowledge. She took a step closer to the table, straightening the folder in front of Charles, the soft rustle of paper punctuating the silence. If this clause is executed as written, it could result in substantial financial exposure for the stakeholders. She continued, each word deliberate, measured, commanding attention without raising her voice. Charles finally lifted his gaze fully to meet hers, a flicker of respect appearing behind the initial disbelief, the cold, pristine light of the room highlighting the sharp angles of his face. And for a moment, the dynamics in the room shifted imperceptibly, the executives who had dismissed her now leaning in slightly, curiosity and caution replacing initial scorn. Aaliyah held the folder steady, a small, confident smile playing at her lips, the kind of quiet assurance that did not need applause to assert itself. The atmosphere thickened with the realization that the person they had ignored was not only prepared but capable of influencing outcomes at a level none had anticipated. The hum of the air and the soft tapping of a pen punctuated the growing awareness, as she allowed the weight of her presence and her words to settle. A subtle nod from one of the partners confirmed the validity of her observation, eyes wide now with dawning recognition, and Aaliyah, with her composure intact, let a faint exhale escape, a controlled breath marking the end of her brief but decisive interjection, leaving the room to absorb the implications. Charles still seated at the head of the table, leaning back, contemplating the depth of insight displayed, the faint light reflecting off his polished shoes and the gleam of the folder between them a reminder that the underestimated individual had quietly but firmly shifted the balance in the room without raising her voice. Every executive caught in the moment of reconsideration, the air hanging heavy with unspoken acknowledgement that this was not the end, but merely the beginning of a revelation that would unfold. Aaliyah Johnson carefully folded the contract and set it aside, her movements precise, deliberate, as the room remained suspended in an almost tangible silence, the polished marble floor reflecting the soft afternoon lights streaming through the tall windows, highlighting the subtle tension in every face around the table. Charles Whitman shifted slightly in his chair, fingers tapping lightly against the dark wood, a mixture of surprise and respect flashing across his features. The other executives glanced at one another, some exchanging quick, discreet nods, acknowledging the validity of her observation without a single word spoken. Aaliyah's eyes swept over the room, noting the change, the shift from dismissive amusement to cautious attention. She allowed herself a faint, controlled smile, standing with quiet authority that demanded recognition without overt assertion. The hum of the air conditioning and the distant city sounds creating a backdrop for the subtle drama unfolding in the room. She stepped closer to the window, letting the sunlight catch the edges of the folder she had been holding, the glow emphasizing the seriousness of her insight. Charles leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his gaze sharpening as he studied her. "You have experience with similar deals, is that correct?" he asked, voice even, lacking the previous edge. Aaliyah nodded, meeting his eyes. "Yes, sir. I have consulted on multiple large-scale mergers and risk assessments, and this particular clause is highly unusual, presenting potential exposure if not revised," she explained, her tone precise, calm, and commanding attention without force. The executives around the table began to engage more directly, quietly asking clarifying questions, scribbling notes, exchanging brief looks of recognition as the reality of her expertise became undeniable. The room's energy shifted subtly, a low tension replaced by cautious respect. Charles exhaled slowly, the tension in his jaw softening, his eyes still fixed on Aaliyah, absorbing the implications of her knowledge and presence. She maintained a poised stance, neither rushing nor hesitating, letting her composure speak as loudly as her words, the soft clicking of pens, the rustle of papers, and the occasional clearing of a throat punctuated the otherwise hushed atmosphere. She gestured briefly toward the legal documents, emphasizing specific sections, and the executives leaned in, following her direction, their earlier skepticism dissolving under the clarity and confidence she conveyed. A subtle nod passed between two senior partners, a silent signal of acknowledgement that the underestimated individual was indeed commanding the room. Aaliyah's subtle yet unwavering demeanor created a tension that was both captivating and instructive, every movement, every glance, measured, asserting her position without the need for volume or confrontation. Charles finally straightened in his chair, a faint smile breaking the line of concentration on his face, a mixture of approval and intrigue, as he leaned back slightly, the light catching the polished surface of the table, reflecting the moment of transformation in the dynamics of the room. Aaliyah remained composed, the soft echo of her presence filling the space, leaving a lingering impression that the quiet girl they had overlooked held insight and authority far beyond what anyone had expected. The afternoon sunlight slowly fading behind the skyline, casting long shadows across the room, accentuating the shift in perception, the subtle but unmistakable acknowledgement that the balance of attention and respect had irrevocably changed in favor of her calm, assured presence. The executives absorbed the moment, minds turning over the implications of her knowledge and foresight, the room alive with a quiet, anticipatory energy, every eye now tracing her every movement, recognizing that what had started as a casual dismissal had evolved into an undeniable demonstration of competence and poise, a silent understanding that this was only the first step in a much larger unfolding of events where the underestimated individual had already begun to redefine the room's expectations. Aaliyah Johnson took a deliberate step back from the table, letting the folder rest lightly on the polished wood, her eyes scanning the executives now leaning forward, some whispering quietly, others exchanging rapid glances that spoke of dawning realization. The sunlight filtering through the large windows caught the edge of the papers, glinting faintly, and for a moment, the room seemed suspended in time. A collective awareness settling over everyone present. Charles Whitman straightened, his posture no longer casual, the faint crease of concern appearing on his forehead as he traced the words she had highlighted. The silence thick with anticipation, pen still poised, screens dimmed as attention sharpened on the young woman who had once been dismissed as invisible. Aaliyah continued with a soft, measured cadence. The risk assessment indicates that without proper adjustments, the merger could leave significant exposure in our portfolio. Her voice calm, but imbued with authority, each word pulling the room further into recognition of her competence. One of the partners shifted, glancing at another, then back at the contract, lips pressed in thoughtful silence, the subtle hum of the ventilation above punctuating the stillness. She gestured toward the figures on the spreadsheet, fingers brushing lightly across the printed numbers, her movements precise and intentional, the sunlight reflecting in her eyes lending a quiet intensity to her presence. Charles leaned slightly forward, voice lower, more deliberate. "Explain how this was missed," he asked, curiosity tempered by a flicker of respect. Aaliyah nodded, her gaze unwavering. "The clause is written in standard legal language that appears routine at first glance, but the implications extend far beyond standard operational risk," she explained, and a few executives scribbled notes quickly, eyes wide as the magnitude of her insight sank in. The room began to shift. The initial underestimation replaced by a growing acknowledgement of her authority. Her posture remained composed, hands resting lightly on the folder, shoulders square, the quiet power of her confidence filling the space more profoundly than any raised voice could. Charles exhaled slowly, fingers tapping the edge of the table, the faint reflection of the chandelier above glinting across his polished shoes, a subtle acknowledgement passing between two senior associates who had initially doubted her, now nodding almost imperceptibly. The energy in the room pivoting as Aaliyah subtly, without overt command, guided the focus back to the specific details she had identified, each executive leaning slightly closer, compelled to follow her lead, the sunlight now casting longer shadows along the marble floor, emphasizing the gravity of the moment. Aaliyah's soft smile suggested measured satisfaction, Knowing the impact of her observation without needing to announce it, the quiet shift in perception was palpable. The room no longer a place of dismissal, but of attentive consideration, every glance and gesture registering the newfound respect and the subtle realization that the underestimated individual had quietly, firmly redefined the dynamic. The polished surfaces and the clean lines of the conference room accentuating the clarity of the shift, the tension melting into thoughtful focus as each person processed the weight of her insight. The afternoon light stretching across the table mirrored the slow illumination of understanding in their expressions, and Aaliyah, composed and poised, allowed a single, steady breath to mark the turning point, the collective acknowledgement of her knowledge and presence settling over the room like a quiet, unspoken agreement, each executive now engaged, not by fear or expectation, but by recognition of her capability. The soft rustle of papers and the faint hum of distant traffic framing the evolving scene, a subtle prelude to the deeper revelations still to unfold. Aaliyah Johnson took a slow, deliberate step toward the center of the room, the subtle click of her polished heels against the marble floor punctuating the quiet that had settled over the executives, her gaze steady, unwavering, as she let the light from the large windows fall across the contract, emphasizing the precision of each highlighted clause, the faint hum of the air conditioning filling the space between her words. Upon review, the projected financial impact could be mitigated by adjusting the terms to ensure the exposure is evenly distributed, she said, voice calm, yet carrying a weight that demanded attention. Charles Whitman leaned forward, fingers steepled, his eyes narrowing as he traced the paragraph she indicated, the soft reflection of the overhead lights dancing across his suit, mirroring the careful balance of scrutiny and recognition forming in the room. Aaliyah shifted slightly, allowing her presence to fill the space, each executive leaning in just a fraction, pens poised, screens open, their earlier skepticism melting into curiosity, murmurs of agreement and quiet questions exchanged. The subtle rhythm of the room altered, the polished surface of the table reflecting the slow realization that the underestimated young woman had insight far beyond her initial appearance. She gestured gently toward a chart displaying potential liabilities, guiding attention without a word. The executives followed instinctively, the sunlight catching the fine lines of her expression, highlighting the confidence and clarity that had remained hidden until this precise moment. Charles exhaled slowly, a faint crease forming between his brows, acknowledging internally that her analysis was not only accurate but crucial, the soft shuffle of papers and tapping of pens accentuating the gravity of the observations she presented. The other executives began to adjust, nodding subtly, exchanging glances that confirmed the growing acknowledgement of her competence. Aaliyah allowed herself a small, controlled smile, knowing the impact of her insight without needing external validation, the atmosphere thick with a quiet, anticipatory tension, every movement she made measured, deliberate, her composure commanding the attention and respect that words alone could not. She reached toward the side of the table, lightly tapping the folder to emphasize the importance of the clause, eyes locking briefly with each executive, a silent communication that underscored her authority. The soft flicker of light on the marble floor mirrored the subtle shift in perception, heads now leaning in, pens moving, fingers tapping lightly on laptops, absorbing the implications of her guidance. Charles finally leaned back, a faint nod acknowledging both the accuracy and the weight of her insight. The once dismissive energy of the room transformed into a focused, attentive engagement, every executive acutely aware that the young woman who had entered moments ago had fundamentally altered the dynamic, the quiet power of her presence resonating throughout the space. The distant city sounds barely audible against the concentrated silence, and Aaliyah, poised, composed, allowed the moment to settle, her calm authority a quiet but unmistakable signal that the balance of influence had shifted. The executives now fully aware that the underestimated individual possessed not only knowledge but the foresight to guide decisions with precision, and the room, suspended in this new reality, waited, absorbing the depth of her insight and the subtle command of her presence, knowing that this was only the beginning of a broader understanding yet to unfold. Aaliyah Johnson took a measured breath, letting the room absorb her presence, her hand hovering lightly over the edge of the folder as she allowed the weight of her insight to settle among the executives, the sunlight casting long, sharp reflections across the polished floor, glinting off the silver frames of laptops and the edges of water glasses, creating a subtle interplay of light and shadow that mirrored the shift in perception. Charles Whitman shifted in his seat, eyes narrowing as he traced her fingers on the page, the quiet authority in her gesture conveying a command without a word. The executives leaned in, subtle murmurs of acknowledgement passing between them, heads nodding almost imperceptibly as the reality of her expertise crystallized. Aaliyah allowed her gaze to sweep the room, catching the smallest flickers of curiosity and surprise. The faint hum of the ventilation and the distant city sounds fading into the background, replaced by the quiet cadence of her explanation. The clause, if left unaddressed, could redirect liabilities in a manner that significantly alters our risk profile. She continued, her voice steady and calm, each word deliberate, carrying a quiet insistence that drew attention naturally. A junior analyst scribbled notes rapidly, exchanging a glance with a partner who raised a subtle eyebrow, the acknowledgement passing like a silent current through the room. Aaliyah leaned slightly forward, pointing to a subsection with her index finger, the sunlight catching the subtle lines of the paper as if emphasizing her point. The executives followed her guidance instinctively, the earlier laughter and dismissiveness replaced by focused consideration. Charles Whitman exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping lightly against the table, the tension in his jaw easing as he considered the implications. Aaliyah allowed herself a brief, composed smile, knowing the room had begun to recognize the depth of her understanding, the polished marble and glass, reflecting not only the light but the shift in respect that had quietly taken hold. She stepped back, straightening her posture, the air seeming to vibrate with a new awareness, every executive adjusting, pens moving, laptops tilting to follow the papers she had indicated, the subtle shift in energy almost tangible. Charles tilted his head, voice quieter. "You have handled similar assessments before, correct?" he asked. The earlier skepticism replaced by a tentative curiosity. Aaliyah nodded. "Yes, sir. I have guided large-scale mergers and risk evaluations previously, and this particular clause requires careful attention to prevent exposure," she replied, letting her calm confidence carry the point. The room leaning in, absorbing the clarity and precision she offered, the faint rustle of papers and the soft tap of a pen marking the rhythm of understanding. The atmosphere charged with attentive focus, every executive now acutely aware of the underestimated presence in the room. Aaliyah's subtle authority filling the space, a quiet command that did not require volume or force. The afternoon light stretching across the table, shadows lengthening, reflecting the transformation in perception, her measured movements, gestures, and steady gaze asserting influence without a word raised in competition, and the executives, now fully engaged, sat in a renewed attentiveness, realizing that the young woman they had overlooked had subtly, firmly, and irrevocably shifted the dynamic, the quiet confidence in her stance resonating throughout the room, the air thick with anticipation for the next steps, and every observer conscious that the balance of insight and authority had quietly moved to her favor, a prelude to the further revelations yet to come as she maintained her composed and commanding presence. Aaliyah Johnson straightened her posture, letting the folder rest lightly against the table as she observed the subtle shift in the room. The executives leaning in closer, their earlier dismissiveness replaced by focused attention, the sunlight streaming through the tall windows now warming the polished wood, casting elongated reflections across the floor that mirrored the new weight of perception settling over the space. Charles Whitman shifted in his chair, eyes narrowing thoughtfully as he traced the sections she had highlighted, the quiet hum of the air conditioning blending with the soft scratching of pens as the team began to annotate the documents. Aaliyah allowed her gaze to sweep the room, catching the flicker of intrigue, surprise, and cautious respect in every face, her movements deliberate yet unassuming, fingers lightly brushing the edge of the folder, a gesture that carried authority without arrogance. She spoke again, voice calm and clear. The potential impact on projected earnings can be mitigated through precise adjustments to the liability structure, ensuring compliance and stability across all portfolios. And the room responded with subtle shifts, heads inclining, pens scratching more rapidly, murmurs of acknowledgement passing quietly between partners. Aaliyah stepped closer to the projection screen, pointing toward specific figures with a gentle tap, the light from the windows reflecting off the charts and graphs, highlighting the precision of her observation. Charles leaned forward, resting his hands on the table, the crease between his brows softening as he took in the clarity of her explanation. Other executives shifted in their seats, eyes tracing her gestures, laptops tilting to catch the numbers she emphasized. The once dismissive atmosphere now charged with attentive engagement. Aaliyah's subtle authority filled the space, her composed demeanor drawing recognition without confrontation. The sunlight catching the polished edges of the table and glasses, emphasizing the moment of acknowledgement. She allowed a faint, controlled smile to cross her lips, the room absorbing the quiet assertion of competence. Charles finally straightened, nodding slightly, the tension easing as he recognized the depth of her insight, a faint murmur of approval rippling through the team, the polished marble and wood surfaces reflecting the transformation, the air thick with concentration and anticipation. Every movement she made precise and deliberate, a demonstration of calm command that commanded respect. The executives, now leaning fully into her analysis, pens moving, eyes focused, adjusting to the understanding that the underestimated individual had shifted the dynamics of influence in the room. The distant city sounds fading into the background as the weight of her presence became the defining element of the moment. Aaliyah Johnson, poised and unwavering, allowed the subtle yet undeniable authority of her expertise to permeate the room, each executive absorbing the realization that their prior assumptions had been incomplete. The soft rustle of paper and gentle tap of pen punctuating the shift in perception, the sunlight stretching longer across the floor, shadows falling in patterns that mirrored the new balance of attention and respect. And as she lightly touched the folder one last time, a quiet affirmation passed through the room, signaling that the underestimated presence had firmly established influence, the acknowledgement unspoken yet palpable, leaving the executives to consider the deeper implications of her insight and authority, knowing that the dynamics had irrevocably changed and that the unfolding decisions would now be informed by the clarity and confidence she had introduced. Aaliyah Johnson held her gaze across the conference table, letting the quiet energy of the room settle. The executives now fully attentive, leaning slightly forward, their pens paused mid-scratch, screens dimmed as each tried to process the subtle weight of her insight. The sunlight shifting through the windows cast warm reflections along the polished surface of the table, glinting against folders and laptops, creating a quiet rhythm that seemed to echo the change in perception. Charles Whitman adjusted in his chair, fingers lightly tapping the table, eyes tracing the precise lines of her annotations, a faint crease forming between his brows as he considered the implications. Aaliyah allowed herself a controlled breath, the calmness of her demeanor filling the room without overt force, her hand brushing the edge of the folder to emphasize the specific section she had highlighted, the subtle movement drawing attention and focus naturally. The executives exchanged quick glances, nodding quietly, some leaning in to read more closely. The earlier dismissiveness replaced by deliberate engagement. She spoke again, her voice steady and authoritative. With these adjustments, the exposure risk is balanced and all parties are protected, ensuring operational stability. And the room responded with a careful, collective consideration, the faint hum of the ventilation and distant city sounds creating a soft, neutral backdrop, each executive now acutely aware of the accuracy and significance of her analysis. Aaliyah shifted slightly, pointing toward an accompanying chart with a gentle tap, the sunlight catching the edges of the paper as if highlighting the importance of her guidance. The room followed her lead instinctively, eyes tracking her movements, the earlier skepticism melting away. Charles Whitman leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, voice quieter but deliberate. "This requires a careful review. Thank you for bringing it to our attention," he said, the words carrying a subtle note of respect. Other executives nodded in quiet agreement, some scribbling notes, others adjusting their screens, the polished floor reflecting the shift in the atmosphere, the long shadows stretching across the room emphasizing the change in dynamic. Aaliyah's presence remained composed, each gesture deliberate, her confidence understated but palpable, the subtle shift in energy drawing the focus entirely to her. The room alive with quiet attentiveness, heads inclining, pens scratching, keyboards tapping softly, absorbing every detail, her calm authority now the central current of the space. The sunlight highlighting the careful angles of her posture and the folder at the center of the table, a soft acknowledgement passing silently between executives who had earlier dismissed her, the dynamics having shifted so subtly yet irreversibly. Aaliyah remained poised, letting the realization settle in the room, the quiet tension replaced with a focused engagement, every eye following her guidance, the polished surfaces reflecting light in a way that accentuated the clarity she brought to the discussion. Charles finally straightened, exhaling slowly, a subtle nod, acknowledging both her knowledge and composure, the soft rustle of papers and tapping of pens marking the rhythm of understanding. The room absorbed the significance of the moment, the underestimated presence in the room having quietly established influence, the executives now attentive and receptive, every movement and word of Aaliyah's commanding a thoughtful, deliberate focus. The afternoon sun casting longer shadows that mirrored the growing recognition of her authority, and as she allowed a single, controlled smile, the room understood without words that a shift had occurred, the quiet but unmistakable demonstration of expertise having reshaped both perception and respect, setting the stage for the next phase of decisions yet to unfold. Aaliyah Johnson observed the room with a composed yet penetrating gaze, noting the subtle shifts in posture, the way Charles Whitman leaned slightly forward, fingers steepled, eyes narrowing thoughtfully as he processed the depth of her insight, the sunlight now angling lower through the expansive windows, casting long, golden reflections across the polished marble floor, glinting softly off laptop screens and pens poised midair. The room alive with a quiet tension that had replaced the earlier dismissiveness. Her hand hovered lightly over the folder, gesturing to the next section, her voice calm but insistent. The adjustments recommended here are not only prudent but necessary to maintain operational stability and safeguard shareholder interests. And every head in the room turned toward her. The murmurs ceased, eyes fixated, a collective focus settling over the table. Charles exhaled slowly, the lines of skepticism softening as his attention centered fully on her words. A faint nod acknowledging her command of the details passing subtly between two senior executives, their initial amusement replaced by a growing respect. Aaliyah allowed herself a slight, controlled smile, the subtle curve suggesting both confidence and the quiet satisfaction of being understood. She pointed gently toward a chart highlighting the impact of potential risks, the light catching the edges of the paper, emphasizing the significance of her insight. The executives followed, leaning in, pens moving as they annotated, keyboards clicking softly as the details were absorbed, the soft hum of the air conditioning blending with the distant city sounds to provide a neutral backdrop for the intensity of the moment. Aaliyah's posture remained straight, poised, every gesture deliberate, her calm presence commanding attention without need for volume, the room responding naturally to the subtle authority she projected. Charles shifted slightly, voice steady but thoughtful. We will need to reevaluate these clauses in detail. Thank you for bringing them forward. And the words carried a quiet recognition of her expertise, the other executives nodding in agreement, eyes scanning her annotations with renewed consideration, the polished surfaces of the table and floor reflecting the subtle illumination of understanding that had passed through the room, the sunlight stretching across the conference room, creating elongated shadows that mirrored the shift in perception. Aaliyah's movements remained measured, the gentle brush of her fingers against the folder, the soft adjustment of the papers, each action reinforcing her command of the situation. The energy in the room transformed, the previous underestimation giving way to attentive engagement, every glance and gesture acknowledging the shift, a quiet understanding settling over the executives that her insight and authority were both precise and indispensable. The soft rustle of documents, the gentle tap of pens, and the faint hum of the ventilation underscoring the measured pace of the exchange. Aaliyah allowed a controlled breath, the calm authority she projected filling the space. Her presence now the central focus of attention, the executives fully attuned to the implications of her analysis, the sunlight glinting off polished surfaces highlighting the seriousness of the moment. And as she leaned slightly to adjust the folder one last time, a subtle signal of finality in her gesture, the room absorbed the significance of her intervention. The underestimated individual having quietly and firmly established influence. The acknowledgement unspoken but palpable, every executive now aware that the dynamics had irrevocably shifted, leaving a focused and attentive room poised for the next stages of decision-making under the guidance of her composed and authoritative presence. Aaliyah Johnson felt the subtle shift in the room intensify as Charles Whitman leaned back, his eyes lingering on her with a mix of curiosity and reconsideration, the sunlight now filtering through the high windows at an angle that cast soft, elongated patterns across the polished marble floor, glinting against the edges of documents and laptops, creating a gentle rhythm of light that seemed to echo the tension in the room. She straightened the folder lightly, fingers brushing the surface with deliberate precision, voice calm yet compelling. Upon closer examination, it becomes evident that this clause, as written, could potentially compromise projected financial returns, and with proper adjustment, we can safeguard both operational stability and stakeholder confidence. Her words carried weight without force, each syllable measured and clear, the executives shifting in their seats, leaning forward, pens poised to annotate, murmurs replaced by focused attention, the room entirely absorbed by the clarity of her guidance. Charles adjusted in his chair, resting his elbows on the table, fingers lightly tapping, eyes narrowing thoughtfully, acknowledging internally that her assessment was not only accurate but crucial. Aaliyah's eyes scanned the room, noting subtle signs of recognition and respect, small nods exchanged between senior partners, their earlier skepticism fading under the gravity of her insight, the soft hum of the ventilation and distant city sounds receding into the background, replaced by the quiet intensity of engagement. She pointed gently toward a subsection of the chart highlighting projected liabilities, the sunlight catching the edges of the paper as if emphasizing the importance of her intervention. The executives followed her lead instinctively, leaning in, keyboards clicking softly as they transcribed her points, the polished table reflecting the golden light, highlighting the seriousness of her observation. Aaliyah allowed a controlled, subtle smile, the calm assurance in her posture reinforcing the shift in perception. The room's energy now filled with attentive focus, heads inclined, eyes tracking her every movement, the understated power of her presence commanding attention without a raised voice. Charles exhaled slowly, the crease in his brow softening, lips pressing together as he considered the implications, the murmurs replaced by deliberate engagement. Every executive fully attuned to the precision and importance of her assessment. Aaliyah stepped slightly closer to the projection screen, gesturing lightly toward the highlighted numbers, the soft reflection of light accentuating the clarity she provided, the rhythm of papers being adjusted, pens tapping, and subtle movements creating a quiet cadence of recognition and acknowledgement, the air charged with a focused energy, the polished floor and table reflecting the transformation of perception, her gestures calm yet authoritative, commanding a silent respect from every attendee, the subtle acknowledgement passing through nods and shifting glances, the dynamics having shifted irreversibly. The underestimated presence in the room, now clearly central to the discussion, the soft sunlight stretching across the space, casting shadows that mirrored the changing awareness and thoughtful engagement. Aaliyah allowed her composed expression to convey the impact of her insight, the quiet but unmistakable influence she exerted filling the room with attentive observation, every executive now aware that her analysis and foresight had fundamentally altered the room's dynamic. The room poised on the cusp of decisions informed by her guidance, the faint hum of ventilation punctuating the attentive silence, the subtle sounds of pens and paper marking the rhythm of this transformative moment. And as she lightly adjusted the folder one final time, the room collectively absorbed the significance of her expertise. The underestimated individual having firmly established authority and reshape perception in a way that would guide the next stage of decisions with clarity and confidence. Aaliyah Johnson paused for a moment, letting the room settle into the charged quiet that had been building since her first interjection, the polished marble and dark wood reflecting the low afternoon sun, glinting softly against the edges of laptops and pens. Charles Whitman leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping lightly against the table as he stared at the highlighted sections, the crease between his brows deepening with contemplation, a silent acknowledgement of the gravity of the situation forming in his expression. The other executives shifted subtly, some leaning in, others exchanging brief, wordless glances that conveyed both surprise and growing respect. Aaliyah allowed her gaze to sweep the room, noting the subtle but unmistakable recognition in their eyes. Her posture composed and deliberate, hands resting lightly on the folder, shoulders square, a quiet assurance radiating from her without a word. She spoke again, calm and measured. The potential consequences of proceeding without adjustment are significant. Yet with these corrections, the company maintains both compliance and stability. And the room responded, not with words, but with careful attention. The soft hum of the air conditioning blending with the distant city sounds as each executive processed the implications. Charles exhaled slowly, leaning forward, elbows resting on the table, eyes locked on hers as he traced the line she had annotated, a faint nod acknowledging her expertise. Aaliyah shifted slightly to indicate a secondary chart, the sunlight glinting off the paper, emphasizing the importance of her point. The executives followed, leaning in, pens moving, keyboards clicking softly, absorbing the clarity and precision of her analysis, the subtle energy in the room shifting further, the previous skepticism replaced by attentive focus, her presence commanding attention without overt assertion, the sunlight stretching across the floor, elongating shadows that mirrored the growing recognition of her insight. She allowed a faint, controlled smile, knowing the room now fully understood the significance of her guidance. Charles finally straightened, voice calm, deliberate. Your assessment is thorough and accurate, and it is clear that your input is invaluable. The words carrying a quiet weight, the other executives nodding subtly in agreement, the polished surfaces reflecting the new dynamic, the air thick with contemplative energy, every executive engaged, pens and keyboards moving in a coordinated, almost silent acknowledgement of the shift. Aaliyah's measured movements, slight gestures, and calm tone commanding attention. The room now oriented around her presence and insight, the quiet yet undeniable influence she exerted palpable. Each executive now considering her observations with deliberate care, the soft rustle of papers, the gentle tapping of pens, the distant hum of the city blending into the focused atmosphere. Aaliyah allowed a controlled breath, eyes steady on the table, the sunlight highlighting the careful angles of her posture and the folder, the subtle demonstration of knowledge and poise transforming the energy in the room. The previously underestimated individual now firmly established as the center of attention, influence, and authority. The executives absorbing the implications, realizing that the dynamic had irrevocably shifted, and the room, alive with attentive observation, poised for the decisions ahead, reflected the quiet but powerful impact of her calm, confident presence and the precise clarity of her insight, setting the stage for the unfolding resolution of the discussion. Aaliyah Johnson allowed the room to breathe, her composed presence anchoring the executives as they digested the full weight of her insights. Sunlight now streaming through the windows at a softer angle, casting warm, elongated reflections across the polished marble and dark wood surfaces, highlighting the deliberate movements of papers and pens as each executive engaged with her guidance. Charles Whitman leaned slightly forward, resting his hands lightly on the table, eyes tracing her annotations, a faint line of thought creasing his brow as he considered the ramifications, murmurs of agreement and quiet acknowledgments passing subtly among the team. Aaliyah gestured toward a secondary chart, her fingers brushing the edge of the page with careful precision, voice calm and measured. With these adjustments in place, operational risk is balanced and all departments can proceed with confidence. The executives leaned in, pens poised, screens attentive, absorbing the clarity and thoroughness of her analysis. the room now alive with focused energy, each person responding to her presence without overt expression, the soft hum of ventilation blending with distant city sounds, creating a neutral backdrop to the attentive concentration. Aaliyah's posture remained composed, shoulders square, hands lightly resting on the folder, subtle gestures commanding recognition. The executives following her lead instinctively, the sunlight catching the edges of the charts and papers, emphasizing the importance of her points. Charles exhaled slowly, a small, deliberate nod signaling acknowledgement of both her competence and authority. Subtle glances exchanged between senior partners confirming a collective understanding, the quiet energy of respect and engagement replacing the previous skepticism, the polished surfaces reflecting the transformation. Every movement of her hands and subtle adjustment of the documents reinforcing her influence. Aaliyah allowed herself a controlled, faint smile, the kind that acknowledged the impact of her insights without the need for words. The room attuned entirely to her presence, the soft tapping of pens and the rustle of papers marking a steady rhythm of consideration and absorption. Charles shifted slightly, voice quieter but firm. Your analysis has provided clarity we did not anticipate, and it is clear that these corrections will guide our decisions with confidence. The executives nodding subtly, absorbing the weight of her observation, the sunlight stretching across the conference room, shadows lengthening, mirroring the subtle but unmistakable shift in authority. Aaliyah's movements deliberate, gestures precise, the calm authority she projected guiding the room's attention naturally. The atmosphere now charged with thoughtful engagement, each executive following her lead, heads inclined, eyes tracking her every indication. The previously underestimated presence in the room, now the center of influence and decision, the quiet acknowledgement evident in every subtle glance. Each person aware that her insight had irrevocably altered the dynamics. The soft hum of ventilation and faint background city noise fading as the room absorbed the impact of her guidance. The polished marble and wood reflecting both light and the transformation of perception. Aaliyah maintained her composed demeanor, allowing the moment to settle fully. The room collectively aware that the balance of authority and recognition had shifted, her presence quietly commanding attention, establishing clarity and respect, and every executive poised for the next steps. Conscious of the subtle but decisive influence she had exerted, the soft sounds of paper and pen providing rhythm to the newly aligned focus, leaving the space charged with the anticipation of decisions guided by her calm, measured, and undeniable insight. Aaliyah Johnson closed the folder gently, letting the soft click of the paper mark the finality of her observations. The sunlight through the tall windows now casting a golden warmth across the room, highlighting the subtle shifts in posture. The attentive gazes of every executive now focused entirely on her. Charles Whitman leaned back slightly, a thoughtful crease softening in his brow. The earlier rigidity replaced by a dawning recognition of the clarity and authority she had brought to the discussion. The other executives exchanged subtle nods and glances, acknowledging her insight without the need for words. The polished marble and wood surfaces reflecting the gentle interplay of light and shadow, emphasizing the calm intensity of the moment. Aaliyah allowed her eyes to sweep across the room, catching the quiet respect and cautious admiration in their expressions, her posture composed, hands lightly resting on the table, the faint brush of her fingers against the folder, emphasizing the deliberate nature of her presence. She spoke one final time, voice calm, steady, and commanding. With these adjustments, the company can proceed with confidence. The stakeholders are protected, and the operational framework remains strong. And a hush fell over the room. The soft hum of ventilation and distant city sounds fading into the background as each executive absorbed the full weight of her words. Charles exhaled slowly, the faintest nod acknowledging not only the precision of her assessment, but the quiet authority she had established. The team leaning in slightly, pens tapping gently, screens angled to follow her final demonstration. The subtle energy in the room transformed from tentative attention to full engagement, her presence now the central current guiding thought and discussion. The sunlight catching the polished surfaces and reflecting across the table like a quiet spotlight, emphasizing the definitive nature of her influence. Aaliyah allowed herself a controlled, faint smile, a recognition of the impact of her guidance. Without need for external validation, every executive now fully attuned to her insight and foresight, the soft rustle of paper and light tapping of pens providing a rhythmic underscore to the room's concentrated energy, the room alive with a thoughtful awareness that the underestimated individual had subtly, yet irrevocably, shifted the balance of perception and authority, her calm and composed demeanor maintaining focus, drawing recognition without assertion, the sunlight stretching long. Across the floor, shadows elongating, mirroring the quiet but unmistakable transformation that had taken place. Charles finally straightened, a soft exhalation marking the end of internal deliberation, his gaze settling on Aaliyah with an expression blending respect, intrigue, and acknowledgement of her thoroughness, the executives nodding subtly, pens moving, screens capturing details. The polished room now a reflection of clarity, engagement, and attentive observation. Aaliyah remained poised, the quiet command of her presence filling the space, each subtle gesture reinforcing her authority. And as the sunlight shifted slowly toward the horizon, casting long, warm reflections, the room held a suspended understanding that her composed, deliberate, and insightful guidance had irrevocably established both recognition and influence, leaving an enduring impression of competence, calm confidence, and the quiet power of thoughtful presence that would guide the decisions yet to unfold.